division again. He was a director of consulting and compliance solutions for Contact Center Compliance, DNC.com. He runs the client risk assessment and consulting division. He helps clients identify and ameliorate TCPA risk within their process, policy, and procedures, and to navigate the complexities of marketing regulation. Additionally, Neal brings his extensive experience in the areas of customer acquisition, loyalty, and merchant processing to facilitate a systematic approach to compliance best practice.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We had a nice lunch. Up on the panel today, we have three outstanding experts in the areas of compliance, something that's all near and dear to our hearts, even if we don't want it to be. Immediately to my left, Chris is a senior attorney at MacMurray and Schuster, where he works with the firm's compliance and litigation practice area. In this comprehensive role, he helps clients nationwide understand and comply with state and federal telemarketing and privacy laws, improves and provides defense against government enforcement action and litigation and consumer protection matters. Not at rest from running down the hall. Age. Bringing more than a decade of experience, Chris has worked with businesses of all sizes across highly regulated industries, including retail, financial services, healthcare, and energy. He has extensive experience with TCPA and other telemarketing laws and has helped businesses develop proactive compliance programs, as well as successfully defended them in litigation and class action lawsuits. Next to Chris is Christian, is the Executive Director of Sales at NobelBiz, which helps contact centers improve business outcomes through contact center software and telecom technology. You saw his outstanding presentation just moments ago. He leads the sales organization, including client advocate groups, driving product optimization and implementing industry best practices to achieve better business performance. With more than 15 years of leveraging technology and creative tactics to drive outcomes, he has worked with some of the largest enterprise contact centers, BPOs, and global CCaaS providers in the world. As a native of San Diego, did I get that right?
San Diego.
There you go. Christian is living the dream in sunny San Diego, California. Away from the fires?
Yes, just don't wake me up in that dream.
And next is Reid Hauser, and Reid is the head of global compliance and is privacy officer with Sitel Group and is located in Omaha, Nebraska. Sitel has 75,000 associates, which operates in 70 countries worldwide. Mr. Hauser has worked in the teleservices industry for 15 years and has more than 25 years of regulatory compliance experience. Reid leads Sitel's global regulatory compliance and privacy program that includes privacy, healthcare, telemarketing, do not call, collections, licensing, and registration efforts. He is responsible for ensuring compliance with all federal, state, provincial rules that impact Sitel and its clients globally. From do not call to state privacy issues, Reid leads both internal and external clients through the maze of regulatory issues and works to find solutions to meet their needs. Reid is also the chair of PACE's Compliance Officers Forum, as well as the chair of PACE Capitol Hill Council. To start, actually, before we get into it, I saw an interesting quote from the SAP Chief Marketing Officer, Alicia Tillman, at the recent Web Summit, which is a big global event. She stated that regulatory compliant is not good enough. Rather, it's about how you use regulations to protect and provide personalized customer experiences to win the trust of customers. And I think within that, we want to talk about compliance. It's always looked at in terms of what you have to do, and in some cases it now needs to be what you should do. Within the panel, we're going to kind of talk about, at the top of the list, what's changed in the TCPA, and I always ask, where the heck is it going? We'd like to talk about a little bit about consent. That's always something, we all know what EBRs are, but do we have weaknesses in consent? And then something new that's been near and dear to probably everybody sitting out here, call deliverability. And normally we'll have questions at the end. Generally when we talk about compliance, the one thing I've seen is people have immediate questions. We can sort of, if the panel is okay, we can field those as topics come up. Please feel free to raise your hand and we'll recognize you and get into topics that we may or may not be covering. So with that, I'd like to sort of start with what exactly has changed within TCPA, the telemarketing registrations, maybe at the state level, and I'll probably open up with Reid because you're at the end and we'll kind of work this way.
Well, yeah, so I can talk a little bit about what's going on at the state level as far as registration goes. The mic is dead, so bear with me just a few minutes until we get a battery in. But there's been several changes just recently, actually, at the state level with telemarketing registration. First of all, the state of Oklahoma has totally revamped their registration form. And this year, they also changed the annual registration date from December 31st. They moved it up to September 30th. So they've made quite a few changes there. They've added quite a few things to the application, including it's now become one of the states you have to file for exemption. If you are claiming an exemption to call into that or do telemarketing into the state of Oklahoma, you have to file or register for exemption there. They also have added to the registration form itself. You have to now provide all of the outbound scripts that you're using to call into Oklahoma. All the principals have to sign off on the registration form and provide a copy of their driver's license. They also require now a $10,000 bond, and all the forms have to be notarized. So it's a huge pain to get registered in Oklahoma now. It used to be a one-page form. You'd sign, you pay your check, and you're done. So they've totally revamped that. Wisconsin has also made some changes this year. They did make an improvement that really helps. They've moved to an online system now, so you can either do a paper system or do online. And online is much faster and easier. The form itself hasn't changed too much. It's basically the same. But they did make some changes to the rules last year, moved the state-ran do not call list to the federal list, and made some changes in exemptions. So if you're calling into Wisconsin, you might want to take a look at it. If you made an assumption based on previous year's rules that you were exempt, you may need to take a look at those just to confirm that. Indiana is another state that made some changes recently. The state of Indiana has pretty much removed all of their exemptions. So if you're making outbound calls into Indiana, you might want to take a look at those rules because they've pretty much done away with all the exemptions. The state of Pennsylvania has made some changes also, and they made these just recently, and these become effective actually December 3rd of this year, to the telemarketing and do not call rules. I'll give some highlights. So businesses can add their telephone numbers to the do not call list. The telephone solution, they restrict telemarketing calls during holidays now, and you might want to check the state holidays because there is a number of state holidays that would also include federal holidays. So take a look at that rule. And then they changed the definition a little bit, telephone solicitation calls do not include debt collection calls or calls placed on behalf of a political party or nonprofit. So there's been a few changes there. Just a couple of reminders, states that have limited or no exemptions, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Maine, South Dakota, and Indiana. Maine, the real only exemption there is if you have brick and mortar in the state. So unless you've got that, and then now with the addition of Oklahoma, there are 3 states that require you to file for exemption in those states, and those are Florida, Oklahoma, as I mentioned, and West Virginia. So that's kind of some changes that have happened recently with the telemarketing, and also impacted the do not call rules as well.
So clearly in the world of TCPA, you've got federal, and then we've got a bunch of mini-state TCPA regs that seem to be tighter than federal. And there seems to be this shift now. There was a gray area. We talked about B2B calls, B2C calls, and with the gig economy, this seems to be a fundamental change in what's going on, I think, even with TCPA. In addition to, and maybe I'll throw this one to Chris, the definition of ATDX. So in other words, what is an auto dialer and what is not an auto dialer, and where are we going in 2020 within that space, and what are you seeing certainly within lawsuits?
Yep, of course, and I'll step back for 1 second. I think that really to call out in Pennsylvania, we're seeing a lot of clients, this has affected the fact that now B2B calls are subject to the state do not call registry because a lot of people who are making business-to-business calls thought that, they could just put the do not call, out of sight, out of mind, but now all of a sudden Pennsylvania is enacting this, it's bringing in, a whole group of people that, we're just doing B2B calls that.
Essentially under the TSR exemption, they
Yep.
assume for the most part, they didn't really have to worry about it. I know on our side, whether you're B2B or B2C, I've been advising clients to, even if you think you're exempt, run DNC. A DNC will tell you a lot about the disposition of talking, and by the way, phone calls and texts are exactly the same thing. If you're talking to somebody who's placed their phone on DNC, what are they telling you? There's a channel preference, there's some data there, their phone is getting blown up. People don't understand the difference between a robocall and potentially what you're doing, and we're going to talk about call deliverability down the road, but you sort of see a greater impact, and especially in, if people are talking to small, medium-sized businesses, as far as these states that are now finally clarifying that you need to run DNC on everything.
Yes, we are, because that is just totally, kind of the compliance manuals of many of these businesses. They have been operating when, they know they're not selling durable office goods, so that the TSR wouldn't apply to them, and they felt that they were safe on B2B calls. Now we are seeing states, just a general move to expand it beyond just calls to B2C residential calls into the B2B space.
So short of B2B, just in general, I'm going to ask the panel, maybe Christian, if you don't mind sort of teeing this one up from your perspective. As we move into 2020, just TCPA in general, we generally, in today's current administration, I'm seeing rollbacks of regulations in almost every department. I guess you can probably right now pollute any river in this country, but you better not spam everybody. So I'm seeing the FTC and the FCC actually have increases in enforcement abilities, let alone at the state levels. What are you sort of seeing? What should we be looking at coming down the road outside of even CPPA?
Well, what we're seeing on our end when it comes to being able to make an outbound call, and we want to be clear when we talk about an outbound call when it comes to the outcomes of what we're seeing come as a byproduct of what's being put into place to mitigate, bad actors, illegal calls that maybe some people define as they don't want. And so when we talk about the outbound communication, as we heard earlier in the earlier panel, so much like 90% of the work goes into getting that call to be initiated. But then what ends up happening is you can have that call not get to where it needs to go. It doesn't get delivered. If it does get delivered, it doesn't get delivered in a way in which you can have a meaningful conversation. But then you can also see from the FCC side of it, requests and implementation of solutions and technologies to protect the consumer, but that piece of it is also impacting the delivery of the call. But separately from that, the byproducts of the delivery of the call having an issue is you could have queue callbacks. You calling in, you want to have that call because they're not available. That call may not come back to you. You could have an agent wanting to say that if we get disconnected, they want to call you back. That call never gets back to you. Important informational information can get delivered to you, may not get delivered. So some of the technologies and the systems that are being put into place to protect consumers, especially when you have outbound dialing, especially if you're doing debt collection, or you're doing sales, or you're doing fundraising, or even political dialing, all of it, even if you have consent, even if you are or do have a business relationship, even if you are dialing compliantly, those systems are not connected to the things that are now in the middle of your conversation, like apps, analytics companies, carriers, all being driven by the FCC saying, this has to stop. You have to start addressing and self-regulating, otherwise we're going to regulate you. And because of that, now you have to take care of all of the other compliance laws that you have to work within, and then also realize that once you've done all that work, all that effort, those communications may actually not get to the intended recipient, or if they do, they may show up as fraud or scam or some other negative connotation.
So even before we get to, essentially, we're all laser focused in this room on getting a piece of communications out the door. So now, I guess what we're really saying is we need to, one, back up. Do we have policy, procedure, process in place that is an entire customer communications chain or stack, as it may be, where are the inherent risks or potential risks in that chain that goes through. And it used to be so much easier, but now we're sort of creating, as you're saying, that they're sort of microscopically looking at everything that's touching that goal technologically. So the next question is, let's talk about technology. The definitions from the FTC and FCC, certainly the FCC side, I always go back, what exactly is an ATDS? When is it and I'll just sort of kind of come down the line here, Reid, I'll start with you, I'll come all the way down and certainly look at the suits that Chris is dealing with. But the difference between manually dialing and auto dialing, what is an ATDS, what's the definition in 2015? That sort of seems that these broad, bizarre sort of interpretive definitions of what we all do for a living do create serious risks. So I think 2020, what the heck is an ATDS?
Well, I can talk generally about what an ATDS is, and then we looked at the textbook definition of that, but then you have to also kind of look at what's been happening in the districts, and maybe Chris, and I don't want to put this on you, Chris, but maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the rulings that have happened that have really made the definition kind of nebulous in one regard. I mean, we all know what an ATDS is, an automatic telephone dialing system. Anything that, can basically automatically launch a call, and there's, and it goes on, but these different rulings have really made that definition, again, kind of nebulous, and they've changed district by district depending upon the court rulings. One court ruling in the 9th district seems to be, dramatically opposed to the ruling in the 4th district, for example. It's kind of changed a little bit, and I guess from a BPO perspective, when you're trying to comply with the definition in the rule, and then also take a look at what's happening in the courts and the decisions that have been coming down, what's the best policy, what's the best practice to put in place in order to comply with those? Well, I guess there's a couple different approaches you could take. One would be to comply, try to look for the definition in the rule, right? And then take a look at the specific states that are in the district who made a ruling, and then have a process built for that. Or take the most restrictive parts of each one of the districts and put that together along with the federal rule and build your program based on those principles, which would probably be easier than building multiple different programs. So that's just
but there's something, actually, what Christian brought out is something, because it's never a single process in communications. It's never just the contact center. There are pieces of the puzzle heading down the path. So can something, even before that contact is made, fundamentally change or potentially create risk to change that definition where you thought you were compliant that now may question whether you have a compliant process?
Well, so I'm just thinking about that a little bit as you were talking. So, again, I'm going to take it from my perspective, from PPO. All right, we have a client that wants to make outbound telemarketing calls using an auto dialer. So I'm going to ask, first of all, we're going to get a contract, have that in place that defines what our responsibilities are. Then we're going to sit down with them and do some due diligence to find out exactly what they want, who we're going to be calling, how we're going to be calling, where we're going to be calling, if they're claiming exemptions, and if they have any documentation on those exemptions. And if they do, they need to provide that to us. So, for example, if they've obtained the prior express written consent from each one of the consumers to call them using an automatic telephone dialing system, then I want something in writing from that client says that all the leads we provide to you have provided their prior express written consent, and here's the language we use. And then I'll take that and then compare that with what the FTC and FCC have stated as required for prior express written consent. And if it passes muster, then fine, we go on. If it doesn't, then we may have to have a conversation with the client, because if their consent doesn't meet the FCC standards, then we put ourselves at risk, and we also put the client at risk by potentially making those calls, because there's a number of plaintiffs' attorneys out there who would love to jump on, and create a class to go after both the client and the BPO. So those are, I guess, some of the things that I do to make sure on the front end, we go into an outbound campaign right now to kind of do our due diligence, get our documentation in place, and before we even start calling.
Almost wondering, just because we've touched on it, consent, I've been at a lot of shows, talking to a lot of people, and consent. And it's just a broad thing. Well, I've got an EBR, yes, but do you have consent? Well, I do have consent, but is it prior express written consent? Is it prior express consent? Well, I'm a utility company, I have implied consent, all these different sort of things. I'm making outbound, I get leads in. I think, Christian, maybe I'll send this one to you. So I think I have an EBR, existing business relationship. What do I need to do about consent? Does consent follow form, or does consent completely separate than an EBR?
Well, from our side, what we've seen from, as a technology provider, obviously the customer in and of themselves, the end customer, they have to figure out what level of consent they have, where they got it, if that passes along, if they're outsourcing that work. And when they do have an existing business relationship there, we talk about it from our end, from the technology side of it, is are you allowed to be able to leverage some of the systems so that if you can, and you do have the right level of consent, and the outsourcer is making the calls, or if you're making the calls to your own customers, when you're using the technology side of it, whether or not that technology in of itself allows you to make that call in a compliant manner. So there's some people that will talk about risk tolerance, and they'll say, okay, I am willing to push the envelope, and I'm using potentially a dialing platform, and I have the right level of consent, so then you go ahead and use that. There's other people that prefer to do a manual form of dial, and there's a lot of forms of technology out there that can enable a manual dial. And you talk about capacity, whether or not that system has the capacity to be an ATDS, and whether or not the system you're using would fall in that definition. And so risk tolerance is important there, the consent part of it. Just because you have an existing business relationship doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right level of consent for the technology you're going to use to make that call. But then what I was saying earlier is you can have consent, you can have an existing business relationship, you can use the right dialing technology, but you now have to go beyond just preference management as well, outside of compliance, because they may say, yeah, you can call my mobile phone. Okay? You may call their mobile phones through a compliant technology. You may have an existing business relationship. You may have the right level of consent. That call may never reach them. And there are technologies now that are starting to impede that. So consent's important, having the right level of consent, and making sure that the consent is actually being able to be tracked back to whomever's making the call, and obviously on the right technology.
To go. So I wanted to circle back, because I think you're beginning to touch on the ever-increasing call deliverability issues, especially, with spam blockers and that sort of thing. But at the front, actually, Chris, it might be useful to talk about consent. Because a lot of times when I'm actually in there, they say, well, we've got a business relationship. They purchased something from us, and then they end up getting sued because they never had the rights to contact that person in the proper rights, right?
Correct.
To do that.
Yep, and that's something legally, and our clients, I see this all the time, probably weekly, is this belief that, well, if I do have this EBR and this is my customer, I have all the requisite consent I need, I can call them however I want. That's not the case. An EBR is not consent under the TCPA. What an EBR will do for you, kind of stepping back, the TCPA, the two big restrictions, regulations with the TCPA are compliance with do not call registries and calls using certain technologies which require consent. What an EBR will do for you is create an exemption where you can call someone that's on the do not call list. So an EBR would be sufficient to do that. What it does not do is there's the separate kind of consent framework under the TCPA that involves using an ATDS to call a cell phone or using a pre-recorded voice to call either a residential landline or a cell phone. If you're using either of those technologies in those contexts, an EBR is not sufficient. You need consent. For those calls, if you're doing any marketing, you need prior express written consent, which is the heightened standard, which really requires someone more or less in writing to consent specifically to receive marketing calls using those technologies, in advance of any calls being made. For non-marketing calls, there's a lower prior express consent standard. Generally in the past, that's been, courts have generally found that voluntarily providing your phone number to a business constitutes consent to be called on the lower standard for non-marketing calls.
Implied.
Right. But, that's generally been the standard, but there have been recently some kind of cracks in that facade where we're concerned about that. Plaintiffs counsel are now attempting to really strike at those arguments which people have previously made that providing your phone number constitutes implied consent to be called.
So somebody provides a phone number, how do I know, maybe this is a technology question, process question, how do I know who actually provided me that phone number? Did that person have the rights to give me that phone number? And now, is that phone number still associated with the person that gave me the rights? I don't know who I want to throw that one out to. It's kind of a multi-headed sort of snake. It sort of touches wireless reassigned, it sort of touches trust ID, all these sort of things that sort of could potentially trip up an organization of stuff we never had to worry about. I actually had a question, I'll throw this out. Somebody had said, can a wife give consent for her husband? So it goes back down to who owns that phone number. From starting with BPO, when you're looking at your clients, because clearly when you set up systems, what kind of constraints. So technology may address the ability to make that call, but somebody has to have a command. I always call it policy procedure, right, to actually decide where the risk is, to start actually talking to your customers. And essentially that's what we're talking about. We all think we have a set of people we can talk to, and I always come back to, do you actually have a documented right to talk to the people you think you can talk to? Because there are a class of litigators that will challenge you on that every which way from sundown. And so this whole sort of concept of, is that a significant crack? I guess maybe the better question is it a significant crack to make sure, in the armor, to make sure that you're talking to the right person and that right person gave you consent even before you get to what is the proper level of consent needed?
Well, maybe I can start off. I'm not going to touch on the legal
Not the
part
legal
of it.
side,
I'll let
this is
Chris handle
practicality
that
side.
piece of it, whether or not a wife can give consent for husband. I would think that from a legal, but from a client relation perspective, that's where it comes into play, is knowing your customer. So again, I'm just looking at it from my perspective a little bit, and working with our clients, we rely on our clients to make sure they know who their customers are and who they're doing business with. So on their end, on the client side, they have a relationship with that individual. We'll start with the existing customers first, okay? So existing customers, they have a relationship, they've gathered information on those individuals. Hopefully they've obtained the requisite consent to call them or communicate with them, either via a auto dialer, manual dial, email, texting, whatever channel that is most appropriate to communicate with that consumer. But it's up to them to make sure that they maintain that relationship. They have documentation that those records are current and up to date. Now, new clients, let's say they've used a lead generation partner to generate leads. How many of you were, just a quick survey, how many of you were at the DC conference? A few? Okay, great. This is one of the things that the FCC really hit on, I guess that at least there was some surprise there for me, that they're being quite aggressive on lead generation. And so if you're working with a lead generator, you really need to be on top of exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it. And we can get into this in more detail later if you'd like. But those leads, you need to make sure that you're running those to ground and make sure you're documenting exactly what that lead generator is doing to make sure they're following the FCC standards and obtaining that consent, they're documenting that consent, and it aligns with what your understanding of it is before you accept those leads and then pass those along.
Along those lines, we're also going to take another survey in everybody's place. How many of you or your clients are touching mobile phones in the normal contact sphere? Or how many of you even know what the line type is? Right? Now we're seeing more and more mobile phones that are out there. The FCC sort of came out with the wireless reassigned, what I call a reaffirmation. So essentially the FCC sort of created a liability that if I'm understanding the rules right, before you dial a mobile phone, you actually need to know that, I'm going to say John Doe owns that mobile phone. There is no one-call safe harbor, you know, with what's in there. So that says I've got a mobile phone, I know it's a mobile phone, I have proper consent, I have my technology, I have all the different rules and messages. So now I need to run wireless reassign, but yet, actually, Chris, I'm going to ask you, I'm not sure, something I saw, I think Eric Trapman just wrote about it, that there was a lawsuit, there was a class action that's not going to happen because the defendant proved that the carriers, up to 75% of their subscriber data is inaccurate, okay? But yet I still have to run wireless reassign, but I'm running it. So is it just the process of running it, even though the results are done, or not accurate or fuzzy at best, but I still have to run that? How does that work?
Right, I mean, I think that that's kind of the theme, generally, the TCP in general, where, you know, this is a, you know, a problem or a solution in search of a problem here where this has, again, become a process where, yeah, it's kind of bad data in, bad data out, but it looks like that's going to be what's required, even though at the end of the day, it's not going to, you know, meet the end goal of actually driving compliance and accurately connecting someone to an intended phone number.
So does that mean it's kind of this sort of pincer, or this sort of just all this stuff is coming down the path that's really going to impact us? The fact that, okay, I'm talking to mobile phones, I've got my consent, I may not, if I'm not talking to the right mobile phone, you're going to see, so I have a financial penalty that if I don't do wireless reassign, you know, there are some states where you can try to amp that up. But wait, now I can actually, as a consumer, go, I don't know who's talking to me, right? Spam. And before, if you were just blowing up T-Mobile, it stayed at T-Mobile, but now it seems to be sharing. We're seeing major, Christian, I'm going to throw this one to you, I'm going to call caller call deliverability issues, whether actual or spam or whatever else is going on that sort of permeates. And I don't really see penalties if companies get it wrong. They're sort of favoring, yeah, you're a spammer. But wait, I'm the doctor's office. How can I be a spammer?
Yeah, it's actually scary when you think about it, because from a consumer side, we're all consumers. We all get the calls we don't want. The other day, got 21 missed calls in one day. Didn't know anybody. Over 80% of them were toll-free numbers.
Did you get a call from yourself?
No, but it looked like it almost was. You know, it was like the person who got the number right after me. I'm going, I've always wanted to meet that person. You know, realistically, the challenge here is that when you think about it, everyone who doesn't want a call, you don't want those calls, but you want all the calls you want, right? The thing is, both ends, the people who are making the calls to you, and the ones you do want, and the ones you don't want, that communication is not clear, because you say you have preference, you can say you have consent, you can say there's all these things, but at the same time, I'm getting all these calls from people I don't want to talk to. So then I use my app that I downloaded, the carrier that I'm using for my mobile phone provider, my device that I'm using, manufacturer's operating system. They all have their own flavor of what they feel should be you basically handing them the ability to decide whether or not the call is wanted or unwanted. We're not even thinking about illegal versus legal anymore. We're saying, is this a wanted call or an unwanted call? And they get to decide whether it is wanted or unwanted.
Even if it's an exempt call.
Yeah, even if the example I gave earlier, where if you enable some of these services, I'm calling into my bank or my healthcare provider or even a government agency, and I get a queue callback, and I say, okay, it's a half an hour wait. I got to take that call back later. I'll get it back later. I never received that call, and I find out, well, why didn't I get that call? Well, some of the devices you'll see on there that maybe just shows up as a missed call. Okay, well, great. That's an inconvenience to me, because when I call back in, it's not like I go back to the top of the queue. I've lost that opportunity to have that conversation. I've wasted all that time where I was waiting for that interaction. It could be a service I literally just signed up for, and they're going to deliver a product to me. I'm waiting for them to confirm the day and time of my delivery, or my doctor's appointment, or even my school for my kids is sending me a reminder of something that's going on, or, heaven forbid, an emergency's happening. Well, in those interactions, all the mitigation services that you have, whether you chose it or not, they're dictating whether or not that call comes to you, or whether it says fraud, or scam, or spam. Now, the challenge is, it's not like there's one system, one central place that all of this lives within. It's living in a bunch of different silos. And even though the FCC has stated, you better fix this, you better address this, or we're going to regulate it, the problem is you got a bunch of different people doing their own version. And depending on who's your phone provider, what app you downloaded, or what service you turned on your phone manufacturer, you're going to get a completely different experience. Now, don't get me wrong. You may sit there and say, I get a lot less robocalls. I get a lot less bad actor calls. And trust me, I've gotten them all. The ones where they're trying to tell me that my phone service is going to be shut off, that I had some fraudulent behavior on my banking and I need to give them my information. Everything you can think of, a family member was kidnapped and they're going to ransom my family member.
That's a new one.
Oh, you name it. And that's the thing, is if there's a dollar to be made, someone who doesn't have to follow the rules will do it.
Right.
But then now, how do you protect consumers, but then how do you keep businesses who do the right thing, who use the right technology, who get the right level of consent to be able to make these conversations and interactions?
So is that an impact? I think everybody here today, we always worry about, especially with social media, brand. You know, we're talking about customer experience and their ability to shout about negative things on brand. And now all of a sudden, I guess what we're saying is that the customers, the consumers can go, I didn't recognize this, and I'm going to mark it as spam. And all of a sudden, these calls are starting to mount up, and you can have your company now is considered a spammer.
Well, it's more than that. It's
Right.
more than that, because you're talking, at that point, you making a decision that that call isn't relevant, or it's unwanted.
Before somebody else has even
Right.
decided.
Now think AT&T literally just implemented new services on their phones where if traditionally your call, whether you knew it or not, showed up as spam, those calls will never reach the person you're calling if they just turn on that service. So the consumer at that point goes, well, of course I don't want spam calls. I don't think anybody here is going to raise their hand and say, oh, I love spam calls. I want them all day long. You'll say, of course, I don't want a spam call. The thing is, no one educates the consumer what does it mean when they say spam. They don't know until the moment it happens which one of your calls are going to be spam. And when that happens, that important communication, that customer experience, or that brand experience where you sit there and go, I can't rely on these people. Every time I call them, they don't call me back. Every time I tell them to call me or deliver something or give me information, it doesn't get to me. Because you don't sit there and realize and connect the two and say, oh, until after you realize what's happened. It's a negative experience. And that challenge is exponential when you have multiple things on your device and multiple services that you have, because it's painful. Nobody wants these calls that are bad calls. I can't stand them.
But they can't always tell the difference between a good call, right? So there's some piece of technology behind the scenes. So we're saying even before, at the carrier level, even before it gets to the consumer level or the end person, it's going, and until Shake and Stir, I'm going to ask about Shake and Stir. But essentially, some algorithm is determining that this call may not be a call that you want. Well, wait a minute, how do you know? Now, if it's my mother-in-law, I agree with you 100%. But, you know, if it's a doctor reminding me about my cardiology appointment, yeah, I want that call, but it's not a number that I recognize. So there's some sort of thing in the cloud there that's now determining what calls are going to be made. So on the contact center side, we now have a bigger problem. It's you're running a campaign. And also the campaign is not, the metrics on the campaign are not necessarily living up to what you expected. Well, was it the data? Was it the scripting? Or, wait, are the calls getting through? So, well, if I knew the calls weren't getting through, I'd maybe make less time trying to figure out if the data is right? So how, you know, where is this sort of thing going? And ultimately, who do you appeal to? So I actually had a company call in because You know, it's to the point where, and I'm sure we've seen these before, that we offer what we call a trust call, actually monitoring what some of the agencies are saying about what's popping up on your caller ID. So it doesn't really necessarily look at what the carriers are doing, but how many times your caller ID, I'm not sure if people have seen possible spam, you know, when that call comes up. That's not good for anybody if it's a legitimate call. And you need, that's at least a modicum of a tool to determine that there may be a problem that you have. You know, I got a call the other day, he said, check out this number. And it's a dormant number, and the thing, we kind of color code these things, flashing red, which meant that the majority of times, if that number was used, it was popping up as spam or fraud. It's somebody had hijacked their call ID. And then the next question is, who do I talk to unblock? And I'm like,
Well, I mean, look,
Rest.
there's two challenges here. One is the side where you're working with a company, and let's say you get to the entity that has mislabeled or mistreated your call. Some of them may be willing to work with you and maybe not make it so that your call doesn't come up in that negative form. But some of these providers truly believe doing an outbound call should go away entirely. They're actually quite vocal and okay with you never being able to make an outbound call.
But we all live in some form of, by the way, call and text, once again, are exactly the same thing as far as the U.S. government.
I mean, look,
is concerned, but
it still comes down to the consumer's preference. They want to be text, they want to be called, they want to get an email, they want social, that's fine. But you have to enable those things to happen. And in those situations where those happen, you have to be able to allow those communications to actually go through without someone putting their own lens or their own blocking in front of that. But now let's look at it from the perspective of what can you do in these scenarios? Because, yeah, you sit there and go, oh man, how many of my calls are being blocked today? Is it a large percentage or is it a small percentage? What can I do, if anything, about these kinds of things? Now, there are technologies and service providers out there that try to give you visibility. The challenge is that it only covers some subset of the providers in the market.
it's an indication, not an
Correct.
absolute.
Correct. The other thing is it doesn't tell you what to do. Meaning it's not like a white list where magically you fill something out and you will never be labeled negatively again. But what it does do is it says, okay, maybe now I get to have some insight, some feedback mechanism saying maybe there is a health score of some sort with my phone number. Now, earlier we talked about number portability, being able to see whether or not someone owns a phone number or not. But really what these companies are looking for is behavior. Is the behavior of that phone number within their sphere looking positive or negative? And based on what they feel and the indicators they have, like the volume of the amount of calls you make, the nature of the calls, the complaints you get, how many calls they get at any given time, the length of those calls, all kinds of information is used for them to decide on whether or not that call should be considered positive or negative, right? So in that, everyone thinks they own their phone number. And I'm sorry to tell you this, you don't own your phone number. You may own it legally, but the idea that no one else can use your phone number to do something without your permission just doesn't exist today. Anybody with any off-the-shelf dialing technology can put in any number they want, a number that exists, doesn't exist, and they can use it. And if and when they do, they can act as if they are you. Everyone knows the IRS scandal. They were using the IRS number, they were making calls, people were looking up the number, and they go, oh my goodness, this is the IRS number. Then the IRS had to spend a lot of our money to go out and say, hey, we don't make outbound calls, just so you know. This number's only for inbound. If anybody calls you on this number, it's not us. Well, guess what? The average consumer doesn't sit there and think about all of that in the moment. They're going, oh my gosh, the IRS is calling me. They're telling me I better pay the money, right? So all of these technologies, yes, they're great for the idea, but they're imperfect. So how today, when you talk about customer experience, we're talking about being able to have a great interaction with them, is you have to make sure the channels that they prefer to communicate with you on, you understand the landscape of what's actually in the middle, so that when you actually have a way to contact them, you go, well, let's see, maybe they're using a service that if the phone number is not saved in their phone, they will never get a call from you. Well, if that's the service they're using, you need to know the kinds of things you're gonna have to do with your customer to find other ways for your number to have a history within their calling, a history within their contacts, a history potentially through their SMS interactions or their email, because otherwise, those calls may never end up going to them. And so it really depends on the nature of your dialing and your calling. So when we talked about behavior, if you're in debt collection and you're making a lot of calls, and maybe they're calls people don't want, or they're not necessarily excited to have, but they're important conversations that need to happen, versus you're just doing reminders, or sending out a notification for utilities saying that there's going to be a service shut off for the fires in California, that you're going to have your power shut off for a certain period of time. Well, the nature of those peaks and valleys and your volume and all that, you don't think about that as whether or not your call will get delivered or not. Carriers' jobs were to deliver calls. They're supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to just be a conduit between you and your customer. And unfortunately, now they're not. The FCC has made it so that carriers, analytics companies, and apps are in the middle of those things, and you don't get visibility into it. It's not easy for you to know and who to go to for that, and that's a challenge. So there are services that help with that, but it is a multi-tactic approach to be able to address these types of things.
So where does that impact, I guess, shake and stir, which, does everybody know what shake and stir is?
Outside of James Bond,
Yeah.
drinking,
Which it's stir shaking, but yes, it
Correct.
should be something to do with a martini. You probably need a martini to actually try to figure out what's going on. But, in a sense, being able to tokenize and stop it at the carrier level, it sounds like it's a technology solution versus an arbitrary solution that we have now, but yet it's coming. But it's almost like the reassigned database. It's coming. When? I don't know.
Yeah.
But shake and stir, same thing?
Well, it's a little different, but not to bore everybody with technological details, but show of hands, who here has heard the term stir shaken or know about what stir shaken does or how it works? All right, so for those that don't know it, basically the FCC, as a byproduct of trying to combat illegal robocalls, one of the issues with illegal robocalls is spoofing. The idea of using a phone number that is different than the one you have. There's illegal spoofing, which is in turn, you're using numbers you don't own or you don't have permission to use. As I said earlier, anybody can make a call utilizing any phone number. So once Stir Shaken is fully implemented across all of the carriers, or enough of them, there will be a watershed moment in which the call originator, the company that's making that call, is going to utilize their carrier to be able to send that call as normal, but behind the scenes, a technology that will allow to authenticate with the carriers attesting to what level they actually know that that phone number is coming from the person who not only owns it, but has permission to use it. So what that's going to do is create some feedback mechanism to the end side, knowing that phone number you see is coming from who actually owns that number, which is actually really important for a lot of obvious reasons. The challenge is it does not speak to intent. It doesn't speak to whether or not the calling party is actually doing anything fraudulent, whether they're using compliant technology to call you, whether or not they're doing anything nefarious. But it will add the idea of you knowing that that phone number that you get is actually a number that's coming from who says that owns the number. Now, it has to work on both ends. So the calling side and the side receiving, the originating and terminating side, have to have the technology, and everyone in between. If it's not there, it doesn't work. So today, the technology absolutely exists, but there is governing bodies right now trying to figure out who gets the ability to certify and to what level that you can certify. And then once that's decided, then obviously the FCC said this should have been implemented yesterday. So there are test beds where companies are testing their technology against those reference systems to be able to make sure that it works. And next year, I can see a lot more companies implementing it. So what does this mean for companies who need to be able to make and take calls? You need to make sure that your technology provider, whether it's a cloud-based solution or if you're working directly with a carrier relationship or carrier relationships, that not only that they know about it, but what they're actually doing about it. So if they're not able to articulate what they're doing, where they're at in the process, and whether they're going to be able to deliver on it, Ultimately, what will happen is we can see a time in which enough calls are showing this kind of capability, and if your calls don't have that, there's a good chance that those calls will be treated differently, which could be they won't get delivered. It could be that people will not trust them, and that becomes a challenge. So yes, that means another thing you'll have to worry about. The positive side of it, though, is people will start to trust that the number they see is the number that actually is what they have. And so if they have saved the number, they do know it's you, they have a relationship, you communicated with them before, the likelihood of them feeling like that number has no validity to it will start to reduce. And so the trust in the number side of it will improve, which would be good.
So I'm going to throw this one to Reid real quick. I know we have to wrap up soon, but in processes you're dealing with clients, so now we understand consent, but call deliverability directly impacts, I'm going to say, profitability. And the fact that it's completely out of our hands. We know Stir Shaken is coming, you know, a few others. Is there something to be looking at now? We talked about consent. We know consent will get us sued. We know that bad leads will get us sued. But now I'm still trying to deliver a text and a call. What do we start doing on that side, you know, which is not necessarily the compliance side, but now it's the back end. I've got my compliance crap all in a row. Now I'm still trying to, you know, what are you dealing with on the BPO
Well,
side?
from a BPO side, we have no idea, just what Christian was just saying, that, you know, what's happening, whether our numbers are being blocked, we have no idea. We can't tell that, and we don't get any feedback from, you know, either our provider or providers down the line, because it doesn't, calls typically don't just traverse one network. They will traverse, depending upon where they go, multiple networks. It could be, you know, something happen along that whole path that it would impact that call. And we have no idea whether or not, you know, that call is being blocked, it's just going, you know, just going into space, or it's being ignored. We have no feedback for that. We do metric on, you know, we run metrics in the center to identify connects versus, you know, not connects, except fast busies, those types of things. All that gets fed back to the client. But, you know, it's real difficult for us to identify, you know, if our calls are being labeled as spam or something else. They're just not going through.
So I said, and that's at the top of the game, trying to understand technology. So it does sound like you need to be aware of call deliverability, just like at the front end of it, consent, lead, how you're talking to, the impacts of brand, and follow through and begin to look at and obviously be engaged in what is being legislated, what technologies are, because the telcos, you know, I don't know that they're necessarily on our side, if that's fair. So if I get this straight, so we've got the telcos coming in from one end, and we've got the litigators coming in from the other end. I'm thinking, where do we retire? Let me throw out just, because I know TCPA is such a broad topic, and I know we've covered a lot of things, we've got to wrap it up. Any quick questions that we didn't have? If not, I know we'll be around.
I have one. Just real quick, I mean, you know, from our perspective, we're a 90% outbound BPO. And, you know, we use the numerical platform for registering our number, et cetera. And you do get some grading options through the numerical portal, but even if you look at crowdsourcing options out there, there's such a disparity between crowdsourcing, numerical, another source. I mean, you can see a myriad of your number possibly being blocked or being, you know, blocked as spam or a robocall or whatever. You know, it's a difficult situation to, you know, where you're trusted. You know, because again, you know, we're trying to figure out what's the best way to get contacts, you know, from our perspective, and how to make sure that call is actually going to be delivered to an end user is going to trust that that's not a robocall. You know, but the crowdsourcing options are the really hard ones, because they're all individualistic, and they can be pulled into the map how you're graded.
I mean, I'd like to make a comment on that. So, as an aside from that, anybody here an iPhone user?
Sure.
Okay. So, iPhone with their most recent update, the iOS 13 capability, has something called unknown caller.
You mean that thing that's killing my battery? Is that different?
It's the other thing. So I did a test with that product for about a month. And I used everything from people who I've text messaged back and forth, but they're not a contact, people that are contacts, phone calls I've made recently, like a queue callback, everything from people who I've never talked to I have. And with that feature on, 100% of the time, if I didn't recently make a call to them, and when I say recent, I mean it showed in my recents on my outbound calling, or they were not in my phone never rang, ever. Now, the other part of it is not every call attempt showed a missed call on my missed call log, which is concerning because then even if I missed a call, I'm not really notified them. The one plus side is that every voicemail that was left, I received. And then hundreds of calls were made to my phone on all kinds of caller IDs with all different experiences with my phone, because Siri is supposed to be intelligent enough to know whether or not there's conversations via text and via phone. So beyond what registering your numbers can do, which is a numerical thing, and Newstar and other companies who do that type of service, full transparency, we resell Numerical's product to our customers. And so we get to see on a first-hand basis when customers register numbers, what it does and doesn't do. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't magically make things go away. And when it comes to like the iOS 13, it doesn't do anything for you, because that has nothing to do with the registration of the number. That's at the device operating system level. Completely different way to interact. But I think when you said a lot of outbound dialing, you have to look at a few things. In your dialing, is your outbound calling something that is expected or unexpected? Meaning, is the byproduct of that call, that person's expecting that call. They know that call's coming. They may even know when it's coming. Versus, yeah, I want it, but I don't know when it's going to come, or I don't really have any clue when it's going to come. The other part has to do whether it's wanted or unwanted. If it's a call in which they want that call, if that brand called them and they cared about it, there's that piece. If it's an unwanted call, it's different. What I'm getting to is you're going to get labeled, you're going to get blocked if you're doing outbound dialing. Any real amount of dialing, that's going to happen. So outside of registering, spreading your dialing across more numbers geographically and by frequency will spread out the things and the indicators these companies look for that would target the number, but secondarily, if you have multiple numbers that are used for the same purpose, it's not like the moment that number gets labeled that 100% of your calls are now impacted. It's now just a subset of your calls. So it is a combination of dialing strategy, combination of number management, and then if you can register your numbers, to utilize the information you get from it to use as just a guide. But the unfortunate reality is if you don't know the customer, so if your end customer on those types of calls, they know the brand, they love the brand, they're expecting that call, I'd probably say that you want them to save those phone numbers, and you probably want them to have those available so that these services won't impact them. But if these calls are not necessarily wanted or expected, you have to make multiple call attempts, especially in a shorter period of time, multiple attempts in a week. That nature of dialing, unfortunate reality is there's nothing around it, because that call is considered spam as far as these providers are concerned.
Yeah, understood. And that just comes back down to rotation of caller IDs and stuff like that. Trying to use sort of a strategy where you're pulsing out a different number so that you're not falling into some sort of pattern that people can recognize.
Yeah, and the unfortunate reality is bad actors do the same thing. And that's the reality is, it's funny how the services are designed to make all of the good actors and bad actors to be separated, but what you're doing is encouraging every good actor to still communicate. And the only way that works is the way that's trying to bypass what they're trying to do. And that's...
It just hopefully it will get to a point where they actually have a grading engine that's actually consistent across the board, where you're not having to go through multiple sources to try to...
I don't think it'll happen, honestly, but I think what will happen eventually is that the communication of both ends will somehow be able to cross, so that consumer and your dialing are connected between the party that's making the decisions. Because right now, the decision maker doesn't know it's you, or if they know it's you, they already have a preconceived notion of your dialing. And if the preference management of that customer in their app is able to say certain things and they know it's you and there's more communication from the call originator and the end subscriber, then you'll be able to have that middle person be able to do a more refined thing against that consumer, because who gets to decide what's unwanted versus wanted? I mean, that's different for everybody.
And on that note, we went a little bit over. I want to thank everybody for allowing us to chat with you today. We'll be around. You're looking at some of the experts, top experts in their field. Everybody's very free with information. I know this is a very tough area, and we're always happy to help wherever we can. Thanks, everyone.
I mean, this is a tough, for any, even if you're doing inbound customer service these days, if someone's signing up for something and you're expecting to call them back, you might not be able to get in touch with them because, again, that number's not in that, in your phone or in contacts or anything like that. So PACE has been doing a lot on this effort of trying to at least get notification. Because if you're a call originator today and you make a call, you don't know your call was blocked. You just don't know. And the question of the carriers getting together, doing something together, absolutely not happening. They are all use different algorithms. They all use different scenarios. And shake and stir is probably, or stir shaking is probably, it's not a silver bullet by no means, but 80% of the calls today go over 5 networks. So if those 5 networks are all have the same architecture, that will stop it. And actually the benefit of this is law enforcement. Law enforcement will be able to go after. If you're going to make bad calls and someone knows your number, they're going to find you. The problem is they can't find them now because they can't trace it back. It's all through VoIP, and they don't have a way to do it. And that's really been the problem. We're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break for our next panel. There's a couple goodies out there, and then we'll get there. We'll still get here by 3:30 today. So thanks to that panel, and see you in about 10 minutes.